Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, cinematographer Ben Loeb, joins us to talk about their work on After Yang. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Ben. Hi, Ben. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
No, I'm excited to sit down and talk to you about your work on After Yang. Probably one of my favorite films of last year. I think it counts as last year, even though the release dates are a little bit sort of funny on IMDb and depending where you read. So,
Yeah, I
but
appreciate that.
no, I'm excited to sit down and talk to you about it. I know it kind of been like chasing you for a couple of months. I know finally our schedules sort of aligned nicely. So, yeah, I'm really excited to sort of dive in and talk about it. Before sort of start, I've kind of have to start from the end before the beginning, but because so much as time has passed since it's come out, how have you found the reception of the film?
Well, it's to your point, like I feel like the film kind of had a very drawn out release. Like it played at Cannes, what, 2 years ago, and was released. I don't even know really when it was released. It had a bit of a strange release, I think, but I feel like it's gotten some love this year. It's made a lot of sort of year end lists for people, and again, I feel like my own philosophy with filmmaking is like you sort of want to make movies you want to watch yourself. If people respond to it, great. If people don't, hopefully it worked for yourself. I like the movie, and I think it's getting some deserved recognition in terms of conversation, which is nice.
Yeah, I just think it's one of those films. I think firstly you need to be in the right mood to watch it, just because
Yeah.
it's a very heavy film in terms of not necessarily subject matter, but I guess understanding ourselves as what makes us human, and especially like depending where we're from, the culture that we experience and what we in if you're from another country, what sort of culture they have, and passing that on onto families, and then also about parenthood, having such a reliance on a sort of older brother like Yang to look after your kids rather than parents looking after them. And then on top of that is the performances as well are great. I really enjoyed Colin Farrell in it. What a year he had as well last year.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal actor. It's insane. He's one of my favorites that I work with, and you can tell what he brings. It's a very understated performance, and to your point, like I think it's a film that needs to be met with a certain sense of engagement. Like you need to engage as an audience member to get this film. Like if you go in expecting it to give you everything, it'll give you nothing. It's something where it's like, again, like Hoganada and I would always talk about food and the equivalent of like ramen dish, like a ramen soup, and the idea of complexity or simplicity. And this is the same thing. Like watching this film is like it's best served warm. Like you need to go in with something.
This will lead on to another question, but regarding, because I know I think it's like the trivia page of IMDb where it said that you guys would sit down and eat ramen just before, it's like every day, and talk about life. I have like a sort of question centered around that, but we'll get to that later on. I guess it, but in the beginning, it's like, how did this project come about for you?
It sort of came out of nowhere. I was sent the script by my agent, and I read it, and I asked for a meeting. Kogonada jumped on a Zoom with me. This was, I think, in 2019, and we had a like 2.5 hour long kind of chat about life. Like it was kind of like two friends who'd never met who sparked a conversation that became about everything except for the film. Because I don't really think we talked about After Yang that much. We talked about things that triggered us, things we were interested in, and it became this like, when you have a friend that you speak with once a year, and you're like you go straight into something that just works, and it just felt like that. And I remember he opened the conversation by saying that he had some other DPs in the mix that were very inspiring to him. Essentially, don't get your hopes up, Ben. Like you're the last person in. You're the last person in. I'm just taking this for courtesy, sort of, but I'm not joking. But I'm sort of joking. Um, and it just worked. I think I got an offer the next day, and again, like the rest is after Yang.
That's quite funny though. That's like don't get your hopes up, but you managed it in the end. But I think as well, as you said, if you already begin at that sort of relationship with someone where it feels like you only, like that one friend that you talk once a year, but it's just like nothing has changed and it's the same old. Like there's no awkwardness. There's no.
Yeah, it
Uh,
clicks, and you're into the right conversation. You're asking the same questions. You're sort of moving towards something together, and it just works. And I think that's kind of what was special about that whole process is you work with a lot of people in this industry, and you're sort of always hoping that the process becomes good or valuable or whatever you want it to be for yourself. And I think Kay and I just really wanted this process to be some kind of a search, like a human search between us and between the crew. It wasn't supposed to be anything like hugely specific, but there was a process that he wanted it to become, and it sort of became that very naturally. But yeah, I remember in that Zoom he would talk. I would ask him like, what of my work are you responding to? Because I was kind of curious. Like I loved Columbus. I think it's a piece of art. I think it's a masterful film and asks some beautiful questions, and it sort of proves that he comes from somewhere of importance is maybe the wrong word, but he comes from a place of wanting to say something and say something in a specific way. Like there's a DNA to it that I really, really, really respond to. And he would talk about like we both came up in the early Vimeo days, so we sort of knew of each other's work before this. And he would reference my old music videos, but I've never done music videos. For me has always been this like search for something that I do really poorly. Like music, I'm terrible with music, but I love music so much. So I would hunt down artists and music that I responded to in hopes of creating something so I could feel closer to it, if that makes sense.
with so just to say about his point about wanting to say something, I feel like it's very much human stories that he looks for and that sort of
Yeah.
human element of people and it's like what they're searching for in their lives or how does someone overcome the obstacles in their life. It's like
Mm-hmm.
ordinary people put into extraordinary situations in a way. Um,
Yeah.
in terms of like the everyday life that those sort of moments that happen in your life or shape your life are something that are sort of extraordinary. Maybe not in everybody's eyes, but in your eyes at the time. And then when you're talking about the sort of Vimeo stuff as well, like I remember I have an account I think still hidden away somewhere with my early work. But even when you're talking about music, and I guess it's like sounds like more than like an experimental thing. We've sort of trying to create visuals with music and getting that what emotion sort of comes out from inside of you from hearing whoever and sort of going from there. Because I think we've all had those moments when you're listening to music whilst being a passenger in a car, then pretending you're like in a music video, trying to come up with images in your head or while sort of like glaring into the distance.
Yeah. Well, it creates imagery in the way. But
Yeah.
I did a couple of things where I'd been in the commercial space for a while, and I was really tired of creating visuals in a pace that just made no sense to me. It was always like bang, 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 bang. And I wanted to do some stuff that just observed people. So I did two personal projects. They were really tiny things, but it became something that I really enjoyed making. And this was the stuff that he responded to. And it was nice to see that something as small as that and something as unmeaningful to the mass, because nobody really cares. It's something that I can watch here and there, and a few other people will connect to, and it's nice to see that actually yields something.
I want to move on to like the visual style of the film because it feels very much like that you feel like as an audience member you feel like you're a fly on the wall in the lives of these people and when there's a lot of sort of long takes and sometimes there's some movement of the camera other times it doesn't move. What sort of visual language did you want to create with After Yang and how did you want to go about by being successful in it?
It was again, it came from our conversations. There wasn't really a specific like After Yang needs to be this or that, but it was through through our conversations about, about ramen, that the idea of, something that looks simple, that has all these complex details within it, that's kind of where it started. It started as maybe a joke, but it became quite serious in the way that we would describe it. And we knew that, after Yang had all these elements in terms of, the present where the story takes place, and Yang's memories, and then their memories, and then the screen calls. We knew that there were all these puzzle elements that needed to fit together. And I think originally we'd done some tests and talked about the idea of maybe these elements didn't need to be the same format. And it's something that I've seen obviously many times before in other sort of arenas, where it starts feeling a little pretentious or a little try hard. So I think our intention was to go in with something where we started with nothing, so no movement, static shots, and photography, and sort of building the puzzle pieces from there. And then as we were sort of looking at tests and looking at elements, it became pretty clear that we wanted, the human memories to be fragmented and handheld. It was something where I remember Kay and I talked about this idea of just shooting them as masters and letting me as an operator react to what was happening, but doing it differently each time. So nothing actually would cut together, but everything would feel as it was in contrast to one another. And I feel like he gave the same note to the cast in terms of, don't think about it as needing to be continuous or in continuity with one another, these takes. And from there, like each section just kind of built itself out as something very natural through those conversations. The screen calls obviously were an homage to Ozu, and sort of wanted to just be square frames of a medium shot of a person talking. And I've always been a fan of breaking the fourth wall if there's a reason for it. And I think, again, like there was a good enough reason in that in After Yang that it felt like it could work, and I personally feel like it does.
I think with the video calls and having the fourth wall being broken, it doesn't feel like you get taken out of the film in a weird way as well. Like they're quite serious conversations that the characters have with one another, and you kind of feel like with them looking at you, you kind of feel like, I don't know, it feels like they're speaking to you about it, or you have your, I don't know, it touches your soul a bit differently, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
there's also a very creative way of doing it. As like in a sci-fi, it would usually just be, oh, they'd look at, let's just say like a flip phone, and then it would pop up as a hologram. Whilst here,
Yeah.
just a little bit more engaging rather than a sort of a throwaway idea.
Yeah, and this was kind of Kogonada's intention the whole way. He wanted to make a science fiction, but he didn't want it to be a science fiction at all. He wanted to be about the mundane things that human beings deal with within the space, and he didn't want the idea of technology to even be a conversation. So he took technology out of it completely, which again, like I think for this film it works. It has its own vibe and feeling, and especially coming out of 2 years of COVID, it's like all of a sudden it kind of hits a bit of a different note, because we've all been sitting and staring at screens and faces looking at you and having conversations this way for a while. So it's, in some way, it kind of rings a little bit true.
Yeah, and sort of giving that one-on-one facing, as we're even doing this now, you kind of you have that sort of attention to one another, or even looking down the barrel of the camera. But sort of mentioned earlier about going from sort of like nothing and then building up from there with the tests. With the film being set like in a not very specific time frame or well, it has a location, but it's a more of a futuristic location. Does that affect the way that you think about how the film should look, or how you're gonna plan on lighting, the sort of lighting and color palette that's going to be used?
100%. Like personally, I feel like as a DP, you're only as strong as the locations you have and the actors who are playing the characters in the script and the director. And again, the sort of the hunt for locations is a complicated and complex thing, because everybody has an idea or an image in their head of what something should feel like or look like. And agreeing on something is even harder. We were shooting in New York, which isn't the easiest place to shoot something like this, especially when it doesn't want to feel like New York. So it took us most of our prep was spent searching for locations that felt like they gave an ambiguous idea of where and what it is. This Joseph Eichler house that we ended up picking for the family also was kind of found by chance. Like I remember Kogonada was scouting something else. This was before I had flown out, and he sort of randomly fell into the backyard of this house and kind of just fell into the house itself because there's no one home. And they got a hold of the owner, and he was obviously super excited because it was completely falling apart. So we were kind of allowed and able to rebuild and redesign the house from scratch with Alexander, who was the production designer. And the house itself was inspiring. Like, you're sort of looking for, it's not, for me, it's not going into a space and being like, ooh, this is visually really interesting, but it's like, do you feel the story here? Are you inspired to sort of photograph it in the context of what the story is trying to tell? And the house, like, certainly did that. I remember, like, I pulled a camera in 2 or 3 weeks before we shot, and I just essentially tried to photograph the house from as many angles as I could to try and find what the vibe and what the house was sort of trying to tell us, because of how Kogonada wants and likes to frame and shoot his films. And I remember just essentially making a PDF of, like, this is what the house sort of told me on a first pass. And we would essentially go and be like, this shot needs to go here and this shot needs to go here. And it actually worked. But there were some locations that were pretty difficult, I'll admit.
Coming to the house, there's a lot of natural light coming through. And this is what was sort of coming into my mind as well. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, like, how difficult is it to light an area that has so many windows, and for it not necessarily not look natural, but to clash with the natural light and also sort of overexposing the area?
It's hard, but it depends on your process. Like, I had Joe Goller at Harbor as my colorist, and he created a LUT with me that essentially just brought all of the ambience down, as essentially as treating it as like a 200 ASA stock, if that makes any sense. So most of the ambience is kind of just there, but it's underexposed. But it gave me and my gaffer Andrew Hubbard a chance at kind of adding the light in layers and being really specific about it. So we essentially ended up surrounding the whole house with fly swatters to control the natural light and the sun coming in, and then adding our own tungsten sources, because there was a film where we really wanted to do all of our direct light as warm tungsten sources and do all of our bounces as a HMI to create a color contrast and separation. So it wasn't easy, and especially because all of the walls and flats in the house are glass. At nighttime, they become mirrors. So we would normally spend 15-20 minutes pulling stuff out of the frame, more so than trying to put shit into the frame, because there was always people and gear and monitors and cables, and it was fun.
Yeah, because I do like the naturalistic look of the house, and the way that it kind of, there's a moments where you kind of have the sun shining through, and you can you see the rays and whatnot, and it does look quite beautiful. It reminds me of another DOP saying that when he does his research, he will look at paintings and how light affects the painting and how an artist has created it. So when you look at something like that, that just looks like something that could come out of a painting, where the light source is coming from and the sort of action that's appearing on the screen. But there's another thing as well that I'm curious to know is there's a lot of there's parts of the moments of the film where it's spent inside a self-driving vehicle, and because it's, if you've seen like a James Bond, for example, where they have the driving and then they have like a projector behind it where you could kind of, when they're acting, pretending that there's something behind them. But that's not really the case here. But how does going from being in like a house area or a museum location and then being put into a bit of a tighter area not necessarily hinder, but what sort of obstacles come in the way whilst you're trying to capture those moments?
Well, it's always a different like feeling and atmosphere. Like, you're standing in a real location in a real set with real trees and real backgrounds and real elements, and it makes you feel something. I'm sure it's the same for the actors. They're just better at doing it than we are. And this was something where I think we talked about it at length. Like, is it possible for us to do this outside in a normal scenario where we're driving on a road and dealing with it in post and adding VFX? And we just knew that with our time schedule and our budget, it would be impossible. So we ended up exploring the idea of LED screens and that technology to produce what we needed to do. And we had, through conversations, trying to sort of limit the world itself, this idea of tunnels and kind of removing the idea of traffic from, outside our houses and doors and whatnot became a thing that Cognado was pretty interested in. But it wasn't easy. Like any time you're constructing something that feels like inherently doesn't feel real, you're sort of always trying to critique yourself and criticize the image or all of it to the point where you're like, you want to convince yourself that it's real and you want to convince yourself that it works. And especially with a budget like we had, it wasn't necessarily easy. I think it works in the film and I'm able to remove myself from it to sort of distance myself from the construct of it. But it's difficult.
I can imagine as well, like going from that sort of house and then going to an area of like, how can we shoot this car driving through? I think having it set in a sort of a futuristic place makes it kind of like your imagination can go as wild as you want, because you could just say, well, in the future we just build tunnels where people are driving so they can be just lit by the overhead lights as they drive past, or how we can get everything together. I think there's just those sort of moments as well, which I quite like when you're watching them through the car, because it's again being a fly on the wall of this vehicle of what's happening, but also just watching what's unfolding. I think there's a quote from a list from the film stage for the best cinematography of 2022 where they list After Yang as one of the films. And just I think the best quote is here as well, is like the just how you fixate on moments, on characters unable to shake emotions, which kind of like when you think about the film, it's just like you're capturing raw emotion of people, and it not necessarily documentarian like, but I think just having the camera in the right place at the right time for what these characters are experiencing really makes the film.
Yeah, and they're not emotions that are projected. They're emotions that are experienced by these people in the film, and they're learning about these experiences as it goes. So it's again like it's something that you have to sort of meet that with your own emotional qualities to get something back, because it is that subdued, it's that quiet. But again, like I feel like it also represents a lot of the way Kogonada thinks and the way that Kogonada reflects and the ability to ask questions that are difficult. It's not something that needs to be projected out and be yelled at people. But it's introspective, and it's again, this idea of sort of learning who you are as your own human being in the process of it, which is quite beautiful.
Yeah, and I think as well having that human aspect is like coming to a realization of what certain people mean to you in your life as well, and just how important they are, but also what you're missing out on in what's going on overall.
There's kind of a nice connective tissue between Banshees of Inisherin and After Yang, if you really think about it in that sense.
What, as in, go on, sorry.
No, they're both kind of dealing with similar elements, and in similar ways. They're obviously completely different films and completely different performances. But I feel like again, it's what type of human being are you, and who do you want to spend it with, and what conversations do you want to have, and what questions do you want to ask?
Yeah, because I've just recently seen Banshees of Inisherin, and now you're sort of making that connection of, oh, I don't want to be friends with you because you're boring, to what's happening with the connection here with your daughter and family and what it means. But I think it also comes down to like priorities and what you want. We only have a certain amount of time on this earth. What do you want to do with it, and how important it is to you as well?
Yeah. And again, I can only speak to After Yang because I wasn't a part of Banshees, but it was the one thing where I feel like, most of the time you're sort of always looking to the finished product, but I really feel like the process became the key for everything in After Yang. It wasn't just between Kogonada and myself. It was every single person in the crew. I remember walking off set the last day, and every single person, and this is probably something that most people experience here and there all the time, where it's like, this was the most incredible experience I've ever had on any film set, but it felt honest and it felt real, because there was, again, even to the way that Colin that Colin stepped into the role and stepped onto set. He was there, he was present. He learned everybody's names within the first week, and he was physically 100% there, in not just in the movie, but making it, which makes a huge difference in something like this, at least.
As well as an actor, because it's quite an emotive film. They must take quite a lot out of you as well in your performance and sort of understanding the text, just sort of making sure that you, as you said, being present there, but being just having that sort of group of people, learning. I know it sounds silly because if you talk to a normal person about, even someone learning everybody's name, it's like little things like that really go a long way in what you're creating and what you want to do with people. Which I know sounds really silly if you said that in any normal office, but it does mean quite a lot. So the opening title with the dance sequence. Now, this is not I think this is what the first time, and then that Kokonada uses a dance sequence in his shows, and then the second time is Pachinko. So when it came about to shooting the dance sequence, what are the sort of conversations that you have with Kokonada, but also the choreographer, in creating this sort of more of a futuristic dance show, X Factor type of show and opening?
We talked about that for quite a while. It was something where originally we talked about this idea of photographing each family within their own space, so that you could link each family to personal belongings and the idea of mundaneness again. And we just realized that there would be no way ever we would have time to do something like this. And Kogonada showed me a video from, I think it was called, like, it's a kung fu film, the Kid with the Golden Gun or something, where the opening credits essentially plays as one or multiple characters essentially doing kung fu moves over the credits in different bold colors. And it just felt like something that, it's not like you're looking for a compromised version. You're looking for something that fits within the means that you have, but also conveys the idea. And there was something about the idea of just bold colors and nothing, and just these human beings in space, or in a nondescript space, that just kind of felt right. So again, like we wanted all the families to be families of four, because our family is a family of four, and we needed to have their whole bodies. So in terms of the choreography, we just explained that, these are photographs. They need to be the same for each person. We can't have too much movement in terms of like changing the formation, so to speak. But it really came from that reference. And again, like, I think both Kogonada and I just fell in love with this idea of it being that simple. And being about the faces and the families, and not really about everything else that, in our minds at the beginning was like, ooh, it'd be so interesting to see their homes and what's in there and what it feels like. And then it sort of reverted back to like, what if it's just colors? And it's an homage to the Kid with the Golden Gun.
I just think it's such a great way to open the film, and because you kind of see that there is that family dynamic, there is some sort of tradition or things that they like to do all together and make time for, then having that sort of have it as like an X Factor style, well, not X Factor, but a sort of elimination TV show of like who's the best dancer and who can hold the pose, and it kind of just like have some, in a weird way as well. You kind of think, am I watching the right film? And then it's just like, actually, no, this is just a film having a bit of fun and being creative in the way it's going to do its title sequence and opening sequence.
Yeah, which is also like, again, it's the sequence of the film that sort of stands apart from the rest of the movie. Like, there is nothing else in the film that represents this. And I feel like a lot of people have watched the film and told me like, the dance sequence was awesome, but what was all the other stuff? Like, it's so weird. And I'm like, I get it. It requires a certain sense of palate. Like, you need to have a taste for this. But I really like that the title sequence sort of sets the film up for something that it really isn't. But it still, like you're saying, it shows a family dynamic that does exist in the storyline that isn't necessarily followed in the film in the same way.
Just like, as you said, it has that. I think it shows that there's something there, but they haven't cracked it. Whilst you watch the film, they haven't cracked it 100% as a family. That they're sort of building, I guess, in a weird way, they're showing their own traditions to Mika and bringing her into their world, and whilst being taken out of her own world as well.
Well put. Well put.
I'll take that. I'll take that off the top of my head. So this leads to my last question. And with After Yang being sort of like understanding what is human and then also what it means to be Chinese, with Yang, having all of these facts and talking about traditions with Mika so she doesn't lose that identity. What is something that you're going to pass on to your children, if you have any? And are there traditions that your family have or something that you've grown up with that you want to sort of share and experience with them?
Well, that's a hard question, my friend. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I think this idea of tradition is something that's always been something that I've missed. I have a family that is fairly disconnected and disjointed. Like we're very close, all of us, but it's not one of those stereotypical A4 type families. And I think the idea of human connection and the question of who you are as a person is more what I would like to sort of pass down as the ability to stay open with one another and ask questions and be honest and sort of speak truthfully, but without necessarily censoring things that most people might find uncomfortable. And I feel like, again, like the film itself deals with a lot of these things that, again, they're subdued and very subtle, but I feel like it's bold in the way that it talks about it. And I feel like if we translate that into the way that human beings interact now, and maybe more and more the inability to have that type of face-to-face conversation about things that might feel uncomfortable or be uncomfortable, to get to something that actually is real, because there's so much that isn't. I would say it's the willingness or the ability to continue that conversation more than anything.
That wasn't what I was expecting in terms of answer. I thought there'd be various sort of family, but I like the sort of rawness of it and the honesty side of it all. Because I think there's always, I guess, if because I have like an Eastern European heritage, so there's
Me
sort of
too.
oh, whereabouts?
Latvia.
Okay, well, I've got family from Poland, and it's just there's little things that I hope to pass on to kids once I have kids, of like those traditions of, I don't know, name day, or if you've got like children's day, all these little days sort of thing, and just sort of keep those traditions alive as well.
Yeah. For me, it's like I wish I had those traditions. For me, it's like the ability to stay in the present moment and really just fully engage with someone that you're with. And it's like this is something that I think most people struggle with today in some form or way. And especially when you as a mid-30s person, like I remember elements from my childhood. They're not big things. They're really small things that stick to my brain, where I know what it takes to create one of those memories for someone, to create something that you actually want to bring with you. And it doesn't require a whole ton. So it's just this ability to sort of stay present in those moments. The
Yeah,
second answer to the last question.
and I'll take
Boom.
that. I think that is a great way to end the episode. Ben, thank you again for taking the time to talk to me. After Yang is streaming on Now TV in the UK, and if you have a chance and you have a chance, sit down, watch it, enjoy it, and just get immersed into that world. Yes, thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care and bye bye. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.